Welcome, smart humans, to Waves of Wisdom, Summer Conversations with Smart Minds. Because this summer, I invite you on an inspiring and transformative journey as I explore the minds and lives of extraordinary smart humans. I'm, of course, your host of the Managing the Smart Mind podcast, Elsa Kramer, also known as Coach Kramer. And throughout this scintillating summer series, we're going to be riding the waves of the inspiring lives of lots of very different people with bright brains. In each interview, I have the privilege of engaging in captivating conversations with amazing smart humans, from poets to startup founders, from artists to entrepreneurs, and from stand-up comedians to swamis. This summer, we'll be delving into the depths of their wisdom, and we're going to draw lots of inspiration from their unique perspectives, their choices, and experiences. Waves of Wisdom is not just about high IQ or being fast-brained. It's about how to harness your intelligence and your heart to make a meaningful impact. You're going to learn about strategies, tools, and shifts these smart minds have employed to navigate the complexity of being a fast-brained human on this crazy planet. We're going to explore all the ways in which you too can design a life that works with your smart mind. Whether you have a well or not so well managed smart mind, this summer series of Waves of Wisdom will help guide you on your quest for knowledge, inspiration, and personal growth. Enjoy. This is episode 84, Embracing Uniqueness. Mícheál Ó Súilleabháin's journey to finding his voice. Hey, smart humans, I have something very exciting and different from my usual offerings for you on this episode. There is lots to learn from today's guests for sure, but there's also a lot to enjoy. Poetry and song. And yes, I may be getting a little teary-eyed in the process, but in the best possible way. My guest is Mícheál Ó Súilleabháin, an Irish poet, musician, ethnomusicologist, and many, many other things, which is exactly why I wanted to interview him, because he is such a great example of how you can do many different things with your smart mind. Now, Mícheál comes from an Irish family steeped in traditional music and academia. He studied music at University College Cork and got an MA in ethnomusicology before becoming a freelance music educator with a specialisation in rap and human beatboxing. So fun. He's also performed all over the world with his brother in their acoustic pop duo Size 2 Shoes, but then decided that he wanted a deeper way of engaging with music and poetry, diving into the traditions passed down to him by his parents, who are both icons of Irish traditional culture. Thus began his journey as a speaker, guide, and poet, and he published his first book of poetry called Early Music in 2020. Now, this isn't even half of it, right? During our conversation, we dive into so many different topics and fields. So he engages in like art, nature, sacred sites. I mean, I can't even begin to list them all. You're going to learn about the significance of finding your voice. Things like repetition, the value of apprenticeship, taking time for deep learning, the therapeutic nature of art and music, and the role of tradition and lineage in the arts. I hope that this conversation will leave you with a even deeper appreciation for the arts and a renewed sense of inspiration to explore your own creative journey. Enjoy this beautiful session with Mícheál Ó Súilleabháin. All right. I am so happy, people, to have on the podcast Mícheál Ó Súilleabháin. Welcome, and thank you for teaching me how to pronounce that.
If I can teach you anything, Elsa, you're an extraordinary person. So I'd be surprised if I taught you anything.
Listen, there is so much, and I think we agree on this, as we agree on many things. There is always so much left to learn, which is so fun. And the reason I wanted to have you, well, there's many reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast, but I love to have like different voices. So actually this morning I spent talking about AI, Silicon Valley, right? All the things. But then I was prepping for this and I noticed like my thirst almost for art, for music, for poetry, for reconnecting with maybe even like something like the land, though I'm not even sure what that means, right? To me. But I think, when I notice that, it's probably happening to other people as well, right? That there's something missing in our lives. And I think that is one of the things I would love to dive into today. But first of all, like without doing a proper introduction, give us one of your identities. You have many, right? So give us one of them. What would you love to start with?
Well, good question. Well, I'm an artist. I'm a performer. A person accused me once of having an oral fetish. I won't tell you the context within which I was accused of that. But
is this now still stay for work? Yeah.
but I suppose being on a podcast or being a singer, is part of that. It stayed with me, some of these critiques that we receive along the way in our lives. And it was meant in good jest, but I suppose a lot of what I have followed in my life has been my own voice. And that voice began as a musical voice. I started as a drummer, actually. And my parents, my mother's a singer, and my father was a composer and a speaker and an academic. So I grew up in this house where the voice was the lead inviter or invitation. And so I suppose primarily I would be an artist who speaks and sings. And that has led me in a lot of ways. It's presented me with a vocation as a guide as well, which is very voice heavy, but also then leans on a sense of presence and a sense of courageousness in order to, I suppose, introduce someone to a place. And I think that touches on what you're talking about there as reconnecting with the land. And of course, we're being presented in this epoch with an alternative to connecting with the land, or an apparent alternative in AI and virtual reality and the metaverse. And that's creating a bit of a kickback in my view, because we're being presented with this VR headset future. So everyone's kind of wondering, well, so what's all the hubbub about being there in real life? It's in a certain way, it's creating that synergy. So the music of Ireland and the sacred song or religious music from many traditions that I've been lucky to inherit has really assisted me in bringing people places physically. Later then poetry as well. Reciting poetry has been the latest art form that I've collected in the last decade. And that has been a really vulnerable thing, actually. As a singer and a musician and a drummer, you're always, in a sense, hiding behind the things we sing. Singing.
Oh, interesting. You feel more vulnerable reciting poetry than actually as a singer or a musician.
Much more so. Yeah, much more so.
Why do you think that is?
I mean, I often talk about value in the world, that speakers are valued are venerated in a different way than musicians. Musicians are idolized, I suppose, and can create a certain excitement, but there's so few people who can stand up and speak in a serious manner for a number of minutes, even hours. Of course, the main speaker in contemporary Western culture, the main person we sit down and listen to speak for an hour are stand-up comedians.
Fair enough. Yes.
So we're allowed to sit and be with a person as long as they're making us laugh, as long as they're shocking us, as long as they're, inviting us into into a confrontation. And so the idea of standing up and speaking in an invitational space, in an insightful space, is something that is incredibly rare. And as a musician, of course, born in 1984, so I was 18 in the year 2000. So I'm the eldest of the millennial generation. So I have all of the quirks and neuroses of the millennial generation, but none of the technical skills. And but I often think, as a musician growing up in that generation, of course, Napster and Spotify.
Yeah, I remember it well.
it was the end of the career path of in a lot of ways of earning money through music. So that was quite a traumatic progression for me to be making recorded music in the early 2000s and realizing that this streaming element and the music industry is not going to survive in its current way. So I often think of like the value of musicians and music was just taken away and nobody really raised an eyebrow. But yet we're always looking at controversial newspaper articles of speakers giving after dinner speeches, politicians usually, for hundreds of thousands.
Yes. It's their second career, right? After they...
It is. And there's a reason for that. It's not just because they know the CEOs of these big companies and if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's actually because they're great speakers and because it's incredibly rare and because you need an extraordinary amount of practice to become a confident speaker.
You don't just stand up and say whatever comes to mind. Yeah.
No, you need engagement after engagement, and which politicians have. They have, you're speaking to a school of elementary children, then you're speaking to a factory, and then you're speaking to somebody who's confronting you, you're battling it out. So they become
I never thought about that. I love that. I never realized that they have constantly have such different audiences with such different demands, when it comes to attention, etc.
Indeed. And then one realizes the enlightenment or nirvana of all performing arts is that really you're doing the same show for the elementary people as you are for the factory, as you are when you're fighting for your life. It's the same output with a tiny little bit of nuance changed. And once you realize that, being yourself and having that message, you're always going back to a message, that is a great eye-opener. And you can't prove that to yourself on a primal level unless you see yourself doing it. It's this feedback loop of performance, really, in speaking. So that's
why I ask you something about before you go on about finding your voice, because you said, voice was important in my family, and so many people are like, okay, but how do I find my voice? Did you find it? Were you born with it? How did that evolve?
That is a great age-old question. Singing in my own accent was a big deal. I did some musical theatre. But really, the poetry was a story of apprenticeship and mentorship. So we were on one path. I perform a lot with my brother and with my family, with my mother, who's a great theologian and singer. But we were on this music industry.
Which, by the way, I just have to interrupt you. Theologian and singer. Hello. How amazing is that?
Yes.
So lovely.
And there was an osmotic effect. And of course, in my early 20s, being a speaker and reciting poetry was something I started out as a rapper and a songwriter.
Wow.
And so I was on this path, the path that one thinks one should be on, which is a music industry, music venue path, thinking that was the way to do it. So that created a consistency of places and toughened up the voice. But really, I suppose that I had seen, again, you don't believe it until you see it, but I had seen my parents and others use their own voice specifically to great usage and great excellence. So, but finding my voice was singing in my own accent was a big deal, and learning to recite my own poetry and other people's poetry in my own accent.
So when you say your own accent, do you mean locally in Ireland, or do you just mean Irish?
No, I just mean locally.
So where are you from, and what is your local accent? What is it
like? I'm from the west coast of Ireland, the counties of Limerick, Clare, Tipperary. I'm on the border of all of those. And so I went to a boarding school, so I've kind of a middle Irish accent. It was very much isolated kind of, and it was a well-to-do boarding school, so I wouldn't have your typical Irish accent. But I suppose when I say accent, it's more about the rhythm in which you speak, and the
melody, maybe
conversational nature, like the conversational melody of speaking. And that's very, very difficult, because when I first started speaking and not using song as a foil, like I'll sing a couple of songs for you in this conversation, I hope. And
I hope so too.
But using that conversation to bring my own style into that, at the beginning, I slowed it down a lot. and I was very insightful. And of course, I come from a comedy background as well. I was a great comedy fan. So I used to use humor a lot. And I tempered that in myself as well to find my own voice. Was you have to confront parts of yourself that you are using as a defense mechanism.
Yeah.
And I was using humor really to great use as well, like quite virtuosically using humor to not have a real conversation.
Deflect.
Deflect,
Yeah.
indeed. And that served me well. Yeah, it served me well. It took me around the world in certain ways, not in the stand-up comedian way or on the circuit, but it got me in places. But I had to let that go, of course, once one finds an art form that is too big for that. And there's a poem of mine called "What to Hand On," like finding one's own voice, is an ineffable, inarticulable quest, but it is of use. And there's a poem I wrote called "What to Hand On," and it's kind of a Dickinsonian rhythm to it with some rhyme in it, and it sums up a little bit of what we're talking about.
You want to?
And that goes, I would wish to grow wise. I would wish to grow wise through the gears of existence, to find the gradient in each phase of life, just to coast down the slopes beyond travailing times. To know the right hat for the right company, and rhythm of each interaction, chiming in from the periphery to read the grain of every conversation. To fall in love in the prime of life, seeds sown of deathbed smiles, and the waves of well-being lap at low tide, imploring your reluctant side to break even one cycle learned as a child. For wisdom knows what to hold and what to hand on, which to give and what to keep, where to dig and what to bury, when to wake and how to sleep. And our wish for wisdom, still a whisper, the source of which still buried deep. So, soul brother and soul sister, are we changed by what we meet? For I would wish to grow wise through the gears of existence, to read the gradient in each phase of life, just to coast down the slopes beyond travailing times, to know the right hat for the right company and rhythm of each interaction, chiming in from the periphery to read the grain of every conversation. To fall in love in the prime of life, and the seeds sown of deathbed smiles, and the waves of well-being lap at low tide, imploring our reluctant side to break even one cycle learned as a child. For wisdom knows what to hold and what to hand on, which to give and what to keep, where to dig and what to bury, when to wake and how to sleep. And our wish for wisdom still a whisper, the source of which still buried deep. So, soul brother and soul sister, are we changed by what we meet?
That is so beautiful, and I think that could actually be almost, I don't know, an accompanying song to the life of every neurodivergent person. Right? There's so much I recognize in there, like the hat part, like which hat to wear with which company. Like we could just talk about this poem for an hour, I'm sure. Yeah, beautiful.
And then the opening line, of course, I would wish to grow wise, so in a lot of ways that confronted the nihilistic part of myself, like that wisdom is associated with age for me. There's no shortcut to it. And so for a long period of my life, I didn't see myself as an old person. I thought I would burn out, like many artists. I thought I'd burn out, go into the ether before all of that for many, many reasons. But so I would wish to grow wise was me kind of grasping the mantle of, actually, you know what, I'm going to try and get an average life going here. So I just see the value in what we dig and where to bury, and so it's an emphatic little poem, and it's about that. It's about the cliche of things, sitting with, life is just a cascade of cliches when we're in that negative chapter of our lives, and I love the aspect of neurodivergence in these conversations, this series of conversations you're holding with people. And of course, there's a great era of diagnosis coming along And I often say that, being 18 the year 2000, I'm 39 now. So I got in under the wire as the undiagnosed generation, one of the last few
Yep.
to sail through high school without me. And I suppose I never, saw it as a barrier, but definitely something. Being from an artistic family, I was. Oh no, hold on. Oh yeah, I actually just have to plug in my charger here.
No
Being from
worries.
an artistic family, I always saw that as a gift potentially, rather than.
Isn't context is so important, right? So if and context and community, so you can be weirdly yourself amongst people who are weirdly themselves as well, and who welcome that kind of way of being in the world. And for other people who grow up around people like, what's wrong with you? Why do you want to sing all the time or make music? Or why are you so inconsistent, for example? But
Yeah,
then you have a very different experience, of course, growing up.
yeah.
Yeah.
And growing up, I always found safety in listening. That's always been a great theme that I inherited from my parents in my home. Is this that you can find a safe space in the listening of places, which is
I want to talk a lot about listening a bit later, but there's one thing you said that I want to just quickly talk about as well, which is shortcuts.
okay.
Right? You mentioned there are no shortcuts to wisdom. And I think we live in an age of where people are constantly looking for shortcuts. Like, how can I get there faster? How can I be successful? How can I be thin in 3 days? How can, et cetera, et cetera. And I think like anything that has actual value, there's no shortcuts. But I'd love your thoughts on that.
No, that's not been my experience. In certainly in waiting for a poetic ability to arrive. There is a great gestation period for excellence to trickle in. You have to watch for a long time, and then you need to put yourself in a physical environment that presents you with opportunities to excel in front of people. So,
how did you manage that? How did you organize that?
I did music in college, so there was a bit of stuff there. But again, at that age, and then I started doing some performances with my mother. So me and my brother, there's just us in the family, and then we started singing in an a cappella trio with my mother. My mother is a great store of sacred songs, so church music from many traditions, Irish language sacred song, which can be pre-Christian, some of it. Then Gregorian chant, which is around 1,000 years old and more recent, and then English language hymns, and then some classical stuff. So my parents separated when I was around 16 and later divorced. So we started hanging out with my parents on a different level and creating friendships and relationships. And singing together was one of the ways that we bonded, me and my brother and my mom. And so we started doing some concerts with her, which presented us with a different mode of artistic incarnation, like turning up to gigs in churches under a guise that wasn't a music industry songwriter.
Very different expectations, I'm sure.
Very much. And
Yes.
we thought this was only going to happen for a couple of years and that we'd become famous, as the Irish Flight of the Conchords or something. And we would say, oh, I remember when we used to do concerts with our
I
mom.
used to know them, right? Yeah.
Oh, no way. Cool. Yeah, neurodivergent chaps for sure.
Yes.
And so that really opened our eyes to a different, and that's a cappella, of course. So the power of one human voice to invite groups or people into a reverie, a deeper sense of listening, a physical space. So that was a real eye opener. Suddenly we didn't have guitars. Suddenly we weren't being plugged in. Suddenly
it's very naked.
yes, and suddenly
Yes.
everyone in the room is sober, and suddenly everyone in the room is,
God,
not.
that's another thing I never realized. Of course, everybody, hopefully everybody in the room, almost everybody in the room is going to be sober.
Almost. And so that was that. And there's a great vulnerability in singing or performing or speaking to people who are really listening and who are not, intoxicated or there for other reasons. So that was a great eye opener, and the power of that repertoire of song. Those ancient Latin chants, like for instance, there is a Latin chant, a very short one that's very famous and sung all over the world. It's a Sanctus, and it goes Sanctus Sanctus. The highest note is at the first. It goes Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus Sabaoth, plenis sunt celi et terram, gloria tua, Hosanna in excelsis.
And I was waiting for the Deo, but it didn't come.
But so yeah, just little gems like that, that
Yeah.
just immediately bring us into a different space,
Right. Basically,
So, yes.
it's almost like an invocation, and you all of a sudden you're kind of out of time, or maybe traveling in time. I mean, what is your experience of that?
There is a Kairos time that happens when things, yeah, and
for there may be listeners who don't know what Kairos time means.
it's a chronological time is the ticking of clocks. When I sing, you're not sure how long I've been singing for by the time, and that is one of the spaces, the superpowers of a good speaker, but definitely an a cappella singer. So it's a very vulnerable thing to do, and even still, I find it hard to make eye contact with people who are listening to me singing a cappella. So that's kind of the next level stuff, and one of the is using silence as well. So that long suspended note I did at the end, I'll keep that going for a very long time. Just to kind of tag people's uncomfortableness. They'll start really, something happens when we're listening to that long suspended note. And I learned that from my mother with singing the Irish lamentations, the pre-Christian lamentations. She has one that it goes, sorrow, she'll big and even longer notes than that she'll hold throughout that lamentation, and it's people just begin to cry. And I grew up watching her do that and watching people cry. And when you're a pre-teenager or a teenager, you think people are completely lame, that they're
What's
crying.
wrong with them?
But as I got older and doing it myself as well, practicing that song, sometimes you'd be doing that long suspended note, and I'd have to cut off, or I would cut off naturally because I'd start to cry myself.
Yeah.
So touching that part of ourselves that does bring up tears.
So prepping for this, I was listening to some songs you and your brother performed, and I had to cry right now. And music very often makes me cry, and I think that's a beautiful thing. I'm not sure whether in our pre-chat I mentioned that I grew up with Mahalia Jackson and ABBA and Bach Partitas, right? That's kind of the mix of music I grew up with. I just feel it touches something so deep, and it feels like coming home in a sense, right? So the tears are not so much sadness, it's more almost like a reunion in a way. What's that like for you?
It definitely is, and it's every genre of music brings up a physical space for me, and so and a person. So whenever we'd have dinner at home, we used to be putting on CDs at the time, and I lived with my dad, and I would say, what will we listen to over dinner? We would listen to a lot of music. And he would always say the same thing, something instrumental. And because the voice distracts,
Yes.
And
literally there's so much science around this, right? Like that the brain immediately wants to know what is being said.
yes. And then I suppose I've realized my neurodivergence in a lot of ways. I get quite emotional when I get to a restaurant and they're playing vocal music. And I find it, I mean, abusive is a strong word, but I find it kind of
intrusive. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I find it manipulative and selfish when a person opens a public space and plays only vocal music in it. And I find because it's the staff actually who are playing it for
Yes.
themselves to keep themselves going until they can go home. And so because I just think that I know that for that day when that cafe is open, nobody's going to truly fall in love. No one's going to have a real conversation in that place, because their mind or part of it is naturally.
It's translating, or at
Feeding
least
that.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
being present. Mm.
So and that with my wife, it really, yeah. Sometimes we can't go, and then sometimes when you walk into a restaurant and they're playing instrumental music like Dave Brubeck or jazz of any kind or classical, it's a very brave thing to do for people because on some level, people who don't know how why they're feeling so vulnerable, is because
Mm.
there's no songs on the radio. It's actually this instrumental music. So maybe people who turn up there and have that cup of coffee begin to think about something that they're uncomfortable with and may never actually go back to that cafe again on some level too. So, and of course, people who fall in love in your establishment rarely come back because they're just hanging out with themselves, or each other. So that's not exactly the greatest. It's not the
Yeah,
greatest
fair
business
enough.
plan either. Um, but that vulnerability and that listening always brings me back. And there's a piece I wrote a book of poetry 3 years ago now, so I'm working on a second one. And so in my mid 30s, I released a book of poetry, and it's called Early Music. And early music is a genre of music that I was always fascinated with. My dad loved early music, and I'd often seen it classical music and early music. So early music is slightly before classical music. I suppose 15, 1600s, early 1700s, before things got very flowery, and it was this real modal coming out of monophonic Gregorian chant, coming out of unison singing into this polyphony.
Yeah,
And
so beautiful.
yeah, and it's
Mm.
all often it's instrumental. There's a very strong canon of choral music within early music, but often it's just strings because metalwork hadn't, really come onto an industrial scale. So there's no brass instruments. There's woodwind often, but again, that was quite industrially complex. So it's really gut string and wood, and these beautiful slow drones and things like this before it's not a very it should be more well known, I think, really, because you enter into a psychological space. But the flagship poem of that um, collection is called Early Music, and I'm
Ah,
pretty sure I have it in my mind, and I'll read it for you as a
I'd
homage
love
to all
that.
of our childhood memories, and this finding our own voice theme we're dancing around as well. And it's called Early Music. I learned to make music when I was alone, revering the moment before I began to sing, then breaking the solitary silence. I learned to make music when I was alone, revering the moment before I began to sing, then break the solitary silence. I learned to love my own voice, making a friend of it, fashioning a fountain pen to master the phantom language. Each Brandenburg concerto turned up loud while my father drilled his impossibly strong fingers on the steering wheel, careening the back roads of Bird Hill. My mother would sing alone for hours, Hildegard and Shannos, seamlessly sung. Light would stream in the sash window while she scribbled, illegibly preparing for a performance. I would drum my hands on my thighs till they were hot and red, repeating the same beat thousands of times, honing the same phrase. And in the evenings we would gather around 2 candles and early music on cassette. An invitation to conversation, an instrumental combination, unlocking conversation and making the silences dance like shadows in candlelight. No vocal music to deflect or distract from a small family huddled around only food and flame and the warm faint sound of wood and gut string. A family that feels safe is sacred. And early echoes still bounce back, reflected in the sound of early music. For I learned to make music I learned to make music when I was alone, revering the moment before I began to sing, and then break the solitary silence. And I learned to love my own voice, making a friend of it, fashioning a fountain pen to master the phantom language, each Brandenburg concerto turned up loud while my father drilled his impossibly strong fingers on the steering wheel, careening the back roads of Bird Hill, and my mother would sing alone for hours. Hildegard and Shannos seamlessly sung, and light would stream in the sash window while she scribbled illegibly, preparing for a performance. And in the evening, we would gather around two candles and early music on cassette, an instrumental combination to unlock conversation and make the silences dance like shadows in candlelight. No vocal music to deflect or distract from a small family huddled around only food and flame and the warm, faint sound of gut string. A family that feels safe is sacred. Echo soundings still bounce back, reflected in the sound of early music.
Beautiful. And what I love that you're repeating it. And I mean, again, so many things I want to say about that. I think that is also something we're losing. Like everything needs to be a new experience, a new thing, right? A new dopamine hit. For me, I have this like both with music, and I think that maybe this is an autistic thing. I'm not sure, but like I have songs on repeat like endlessly, right? They will live in my head. They will become a part of my being for months.
Yeah.
But also the same with art. So at some stage, I was in Spain, Bilbao, to look at Francis Bacon. There was a Francis Bacon exhibition at the Guggenheim, and I was there for 3 days. And for 3 days, I went in and spent a couple of hours looking at the same paintings. Instead of like, going to lots of different places, and they change, of course, every day. And it would have been even better to spend a year with them, which, still working on that. But it's this being with, whether it's poetry, whether it's music, whether it's, the visual arts, spending time and seeing, constantly discovering new nuances and things you've never noticed before. Right. Same, I think, with music, which is so beautiful. So already the second time, of course, you're also reciting it differently, but the second time I'm noticing different new things, discovering new things. And I would so love for people, if the one thing they take away from this podcast is to give things like a second chance.
Yes, yeah, no, that's well said. And to know that the complexity, I mean, committing things to memory is a long path as well, and the realization that we must sit, the shortcut theme that you brought up there, that like we must sit with these things much longer than we think.
Yeah.
It takes a lifetime. We're only getting the hang of it before we have to leave this world.
But it's so incredibly rewarding. And actually, that is a nice segue into like my Irish experience. I just told you I'd, been to Kerry, but we also visited Dublin. And what happened in Dublin, there was an exhibition by this Japanese artist called Hokusai, right? Famous from the Great Wave. And loved it. I've always been obsessed with Japan, but one of the things on there, they had like little quotes, and it's something like, and I'm totally going to slaughter this and misquote it, but it said something like, at 60, I began to get some idea of what I was doing, right? At 70, I considered myself like proficient. And at 80, I was approaching something, of skill or whatever. Like, and you're like, this guy is so good, like insanely good. But even he is like, the way he looks at it is, I'm only just starting out. It's at 80. And there's always so much more to learn and uncover and dig into.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a person who repeats a lot as well, but I suppose one of the, I don't want to be completely anti-streaming services that I talked about at the beginning of this conversation, because it's opened up and it helped my mental health to have so much music at my fingertips, and I listen to the jazz playlists, so I enter into this instrumental jazz world, but I've never listened to that track before. It's always new, so that's been a great gift to me and my own mental health, actually, is to enter into music that you've never heard before. It's impossible to find if you have your own music collection. You've listened to every single bit of it
Yes.
before, so you're choosing to retrace your steps, and there is a beauty in that. And one of the great gifts of the postmodern age is that we can now put on a world class series of music that we've never heard before. You can guarantee it can actually make sure that you've never heard these tracks before. So that's been a great gift to enter into that continuum and to spend some time there, and that link between artistic output and gestation or
Mm,
dormancy. There's a great horticultural term, dormant, is when something lies
yes.
dormant. And I often think about that. And of course, that the repeating the recitation a second time is a very daring move, actually, that creates a vulnerability in the listener and also feels very vulnerable in the performer. And I learnt that from a poet called David White. And that story of apprenticeship into a world where of speaking and post comedy, my post comedy identity,
This
was
is, by the way, so perfect because this was exactly going to be my next question around apprenticeship. So thank you for taking
yes.
taking us there. That is beautiful.
Yeah, and technology has replaced apprenticeship in so many ways. I mean, we think we can just watch a YouTube video on how
Yeah.
to
And
make a
do our own
best,
plumbing.
yeah, best man
Yes.
speech, and you think you're gonna nail it.
Yeah.
Um, and that took. I mean, I met David White for the first time maybe 16 or 17 years ago.
So
Uh,
who, for those of us who don't know
yes,
David White,
I would. Yeah, he is an Englishman with an Irish mother. So he moved to America around maybe 40 years ago, 35 years ago, following love. He's a scientist, a marine biologist,
hmm?
a marine biologist background, who had been reciting and, well, learning poems, committing poems to memory from an early age, since his early 20s, creating his own poetry too. And this was a parallel track to his scientific endeavors. So for the last 35 years, he has been traveling around mostly America, but the world, reciting his own poetry and other people's poetry, and offering philosophical insight into those poems and those themes.
So literally a wandering poet.
Yes, yeah.
Mm.
It's like going back in time, really sitting with
Yeah.
him. I suppose he's in his mid 60s now, and uh, he's has got a great English accent, very low voice. He didn't always have that low voice, actually. When you listen to some of his early recordings, he had a voice that kind of, I don't want to say a blockage, but it was more up in his
Yeah, in the
throat.
upper register.
And he's done a lot of work over his life to drop that down. And so the poems do a good bit of the heavy lifting, but he's done a lot of embodying um, physically when he performs the poetry that I've learned a lot from. But it took a long time.
But
Uh,
hang on, because you know what you mean, but and I
yes.
think I know what you mean, but embodiment is actually also one of my cards.
Hmm.
So what when you say he's done a lot of work around embodying?
Yes. Well, one must become a vessel for the message, or for the piece of art. And so when I recite poetry now, I will try to not shuffle on my feet. I learned that from him, to grow roots into the ground, which is
Mm.
the meditation message, or invitation, as well as to so to kind of go back on your heel and just stay there is a very daring thing, because when we begin to make jokes as well, we'll start shifting around, and that's why it feels so there's relief in it for us, because we can let go. But to hold the space, to use that cliche, and not move, not lock your knees, but don't let them bend, and keep your heels on the ground while you're reciting a poem, is an extremely vulnerable thing to do.
Mm.
uh, and it looks very powerful, but it feels very vulnerable. And that's of course, why so many of us, neurodivergent and mental health, you know, uh, vi- not not victims, but those of us who are looking for shelter,
Yeah.
are drawn to the stage, because it makes us look strong, um, but it actually quite feels vulnerable. Or sometimes, depending on the art form, it's the other way around. We can feel vulnerable, but we end up looking strong. So we don't have to be honest, but we still get that relief. And so I learned to really stay still, which was going against everything I was doing naturally, which was trying to make people laugh and
Yeah.
being a vocal virtuoso. And so I saw him speak a lot about poetry and the Irish identity, and insight into our own sense of great themes like heartbreak and work and vocation in the world.
Mm.
And using poems directly and indirectly associated with those themes. And I was really lucky to create my first collection of poetry around his world, and I recite my poetry at his events all over the world. And I mentioned earlier I was a guide, that one of the invitations of
Hmm.
singing and speaking has been into bringing people places. And that's one of David's great gifts, is to bring groups and speak about places in Ireland and in Italy and in Japan and all over the world that he visits. And he, in a sense, he brings you there physically on an astral plane through the work of art itself. And
Okay, so I have so many questions about that too, as Japan, of course, as well. But quickly going back to like apprenticeship, what made you? How did that happen? Because it is such an old form, right? Which is almost lost now, I think, sadly. How did you become his apprentice?
Through my mother. My mother is an old friend of David White's, and David runs a group of people, about 30 people he brings to Ireland every summer. So my mother would perform for that group for one afternoon and present to them Irish traditional song, Irish traditional poetry, and Irish poetry, modern and ancient, and some Irish language pre-Christian lamentation repertoire, and speak about her own life and her own spirituality. And it's an attached cottage on Galway Bay, and I would accompany her as a teenager, just once or twice, down to this. It's the only kind of tourist. It's not really a tourist gig, but the only tourist gig she ever did.
Mm,
And all these Americans would cry from the like
mm,
10 minutes in. They would cry the whole way through, and I knew there was something extremely intense about it, and very focused. The intentionality of the group was very, very honed, though I'd never seen David White speak himself. So then when my parents separated and we started singing in a trio, me and my brother and my mom said, "Come on down and we'll sell a few CDs to the old Americans, do you know, like."
great
So we were like,
plan.
"Sign us up." So my mom did it an hour, and then in song, me and my brother would enter the room in song. My mom would start a round, an old
Mm.
uh, gospel one. Amen, 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 amen. And that goes in a round. So then I'd start from the back. Yeah, I'd start from the back of the
Yep.
room, and then my brother would start from the back of the room, and we'd walk up, and then we would perform at the top, maybe like some Mozart or like, some Irish language stuff. I do about 10 minutes, and everyone's wondering like, who are these dudes, that just joined this
Yeah.
Celtic mystic woman after 45 minutes. And is it good? Is it not? I don't know. And then she would say, "These are my sons," and then everyone would be just demanding.
Oh.
So so in that sense, that's what David would have seen us first do. So he saw that we were on a path toward holding a space with this great repertoire, and we
Mm,
were honest and aware of the transference of the repertoire
right.
orally from our mom. So we were paying homage to her life.
Yeah, it wasn't just a gimmick. I think
No,
that's massively important,
gimmicky.
right?
It was gimmicky, but no, the
Yeah.
authenticity is definitely there. So he never said, "Oh, you guys should start reading poetry." Of course, like every good mentor, he never said anything. He just did what he did and kept inviting us to come and drive a van and sing a few songs in the morning at this group that he runs in Ireland. And we've done that. I've done that for 15 years in a row now. So which entails meeting people, 30 people that arrive in from the States and Southern Hemisphere, and driving them in a 9-seater minivan, one of four, around the Burren area of Ireland, and making these fireball friendships with people over the week and singing for them all of the different musical styles that I have over the week, really.
Mm.
And then in the last 4 years, that has entailed reading my poetry and other people's poetry. So that conversation has deepened, that role has widened. Yeah, so I now tell people I'm a poet and a singer rather than a singer and a poet, which was a big deal.
Interesting.
Uh,
So when did that shift for you? When did you?
only when a book comes out, I think you can only really call yourself a poet if you've published something, not published in the
I
industry.
right. I was going to say I have to disagree with that, but
Well, you
that's okay.
manifested something, like I think
Yes, something tangible.
start committing your own poems to memory. How about
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
If you committed one of your own poems to memory and can do it for someone, even badly, at a bus stop, then you're a poet.
Amen.
But if you're a poetry lover, then you're reading poetry and you're doing the things. But if you can meet someone on a train and have a conversation, and for one reason or another want to read them a poem, then you should be able to do that from memory, because reciting things from memory is part of the bardic traditions and is part of the form.
So great. That was going to be, again, my next question. I love you how you just read my mind somehow. Why is this important? Why is tradition important to you? Why is lineage important? Heritage, right? All these things. Why do they matter? And why should we make, sort of cherish them and honor them?
That's a really great question. And the answer is ineffable. But the main thing that is the currency of the world, especially in the postmodern advertising heavy world we live in, this sense of belonging. So where do you belong? With whom do you belong? It's a battlefield, an absolute battlefield for your sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And sport is bigger than ever, and all of the vices and belief systems are there and getting stronger. And so I think it's that sense of belonging, knowing the same poem as somebody else. It's a great thing when everyone turns up and there's this fellowship, because everyone knows the work that David recites and that he's written, or knows it to some degree. And there's always one or two people who don't really know who he is, but they're just here because a friend brought me. And that's always a great initiation too. And of course, part of belonging is this spectrum of everything from initiation all the way through to...
Right. So that was going to be, yeah, exactly. So how do you continue that, and how do you make sure that you include new people so the tradition doesn't die out, et cetera, et cetera? How does that happen organically, or is there something intentional about that?
I think technology helps that sense of belonging, creep out. But I think the works, that the traditional pieces of art that I've collected do the talking. So it's a funny way. You have to present them in a very authentic way, but also just not get in their own way. Let me
kind of remove yourself from the equation.
Yeah, definitely. But you see, finding the deeper themes as well of these songs. These songs have survived for a reason. So there are deeper kind of themes. Like there's a great old Irish song, which we reluctantly share with our Scottish cousins, called The Wild Mountain Thyme, or the Summer.
Yes.
Go Lassie Go.
I love that song.
I mean, people who know it love it, but it's been stigmatized because it was overplayed in Irish America and things like this.
Oh, right.
Part of the kind of 60s, 70s ballad culture, which can be frowned upon in certain places.
Well, is it like kitsch? Is that how it's, or like, because I have no idea how
I don't know, but it was made famous in America by the Clancy brothers and other people. But we love returning to that song, because really what it's about, it's an invitation. So it's one of the song is "Will you go, lassie, go?" So it's actually, the hook is an invitation, which is very, very rare. And it's all about going out in community, out onto the hills to forage the wild mountain thyme all around the blooming heather. So the thyme and heather were actually medicinal herbs, antibacterials, and other herbs for other reasons. So, but again, they're just two herbs of a myriad of things that would have been foraged and collected. And it's a song bringing in the light. There's all sorts of deep themes in it. And so we love to just do that. And that's why it's important. It's because these songs are part of our lives. But really, if we look closely, there's so much wisdom in them. But to find
kind of a universal language in a way, right? It touches, I think, even without possibly understanding the language, it still touches you in a specific way, I think.
Like the first verse is quite it's very, very beautiful. But the third verse of that song, and I'll give you the first and third verse. If my true love were gone, I would surely find another to pluck wild mountain thyme all around the blooming heather. So when I was finally in my late 20s learning this song, and realizing that it's actually very, very beautiful, I asked my mum, that's very unusual, isn't it, in a love song to talk about your lover being gone?
Yeah, and saying, I'll be fine.
Exactly. And I'll surely find another. I said, what's that about, Noreen, my mum? And she said, oh, well, that verse is for the old people, It's really beautiful. I was like, wow. But I'll give you a sped up version of Go Lassie Go, and maybe we might wind it down after that. And that goes, summertime is coming, and the trees are sweetly blooming, and the wild mountain thyme grows around the blooming heather. Will you go, lassie, go? And we'll all go together to pluck wild mountain thyme all around the bloomin' heather. Will you go, lassie, go? And if my true love were gone, I would surely find another to pluck wild mountain thyme all around the bloomin' heather. Will you go, lassie, go? And we'll all go together to pluck wild mountain thyme all around the bloomin' heather. Will you go, lassie, go? Will you go, lassie, go? Will you go, lassie, go?
Beautiful. I love that song so much.
Well,
And again, the repetition, right, of the call.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What is the difference for you when it comes to your own poetry? Do you ever feel like setting it to music?
Not so much. No, I think there's a bit of trauma in myself, like, and that's part of the path of any of our lives, is we try something, and then when it doesn't work or doesn't connect, we get burned, and that creative part of ourselves gets soldered off
Field music student, right?
Yeah. And I think, like, my experience in the music industry, which was very positive, and we had great meetings and things, but the fact that it didn't connect or turn into a revenue stream or something, I just felt that maybe that's not the calling in my life. So I started learning a lot more pre-existing traditional songs and sacred songs, and I realized that my voice is extraordinary, but it's too crowded in the music industry. And that's not the path for me. So I've immersed myself in the great works of traditional music, sacred song, and poetry, and I've tried to create some good poetry myself along the way.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, I haven't written a song in a long time, nor have I put my own poetry to music. No.
And you don't feel the itch either to do that, or the urge?
I don't. And I think we have to focus as well on what little parts of excellence we can achieve, and
100%.
like you said, repeat them much more and much longer.
Yeah, know your strengths.
Yeah, I think that's part of a life well lived. And I have no desire to put my own poetry to music. No.
Interesting. So, and you just spoke of, like, okay, revenue streams. I'm sure a lot of people listening are thinking, okay, what this guy does is amazing, right? That is so cool and so beautiful and so wonderful. But how does he eat?
Well, if any of you are listening, and I invited you before we started recording, me and my brother and my mom, we run a group experience to Ireland. So we run 2-week-long tours every summer, and one is in Kerry, which is the southwest of Ireland, and another is in around Lough Derg and the River Shannon. And we call that one the Golden Vale region. So we run 2 great weeks in the summer that people can join us for. And every morning we create a little village. We book the whole a whole series of self-catering accommodation. And then we gather every morning at around 9:30, very civilized, for about 2 hours of music and poetry and insight, a bit of mythology and conversation. One of the themes is we invite participants, to come into conversation with each other and themselves, and go beyond being a tourist and really be a pilgrim, not in an orthodox spiritual sense, but in that deeper, to drink from a deeper well, as David White would say, but really to invite a a progression into a deeper sense of identity, whether Irish or otherwise. So just to become part of our family and part of our wider circle of friends who we go out on the land every afternoon. So that's a great week-long thing people can join us for. We call that Turas Danam. So Turas in Irish is a journey, and Danam is of your soul. So we have a website called Turas Danam, TURASDANAM. And that's one great way to meet people and invite people who we also do concerts in America and around Ireland and Europe.
Right, so you tour.
Yeah, but not in a music industry sense where there's like a person organizing it, but people invite us. And when you spend 7 days with somebody on one of these tours, they see the possibilities and the range of things that you offer, that they can bring you into their lives, whether it be an organization or a university or a church, or a house concert even. God, we've done so many amazing house concerts and meet people in their own world.
I love those.
And that's been a great upside of the music industry falling away, actually, is the house concert movement. And then we perform with David White. We perform a cappella song and our own poetry and recite the great poems, some great poems, with him for his people. So we meet people through that. And I offer one-on-one singing lessons online around recitation of poetry and also singing, using the voice and creating an interactive document, a big repertoire of songs. So by the end of 3 45-minute sessions, you'll have a document with so much in it that we could just keep retracing, or else we could keep on finding new things from the world of jazz, English language hymns, Gregorian chant, Irish language, pre-Christian lamentation.
Like all the things.
And hip hop even. I'll teach you how to beatbox. So that's been a great thing. And I just had a baby. So
yes, congrats again, right? Listen, people, 2 days ago, right? And he's on the podcast.
2 days ago, yes. And but then I also have conversations around the poetic process as well, creating your own poetry, or else just working with great poems and having a serious and focused poetic conversation around new poems, the great poems, where we can find a safe space to just have an unbroken adult conversation about poetry and what poems mean and what it means in our lives. So that's
what I'm hearing is that is a almost radical openness. Instead of I have a marketing plan or a business plan, it sounds like you're very open to invitation, right?
Yes.
And then whatever you're spreading gets spread out even more and more, and that leads to other beautiful things.
Yes. Yeah. No, we want to be invited to places where people want to listen, and we learned that we were prone to burnout. We're not that tough, get in the back of a van type of artists. So we're open.
I think that's a myth anyhow, right?
Possibly. Yeah, possibly. Yeah. So following invitations has been part of it, and trying to stick those invitations together in geographical reality is that's
another challenge, I'm sure.
So there is no shortcut. There's months of my life where I don't have that many invitations, and then there's other ones where you feel like this is what Beyonce must feel like,
Yes, right. So much demand upon my attention.
So it's wonderful. And but to end this conversation, I'd love to recite a poem of mine called First White Hair. And I've been watching my son age for over a week now, and I wrote a love poem to my wife, and this is about aging and there being no shortcuts, actually. So, and I'll dedicate it to you, Elsa, and all of the people listening. And thanks so much for this wonderfully wide-ranging conversation.
Thank you.
First White Hair, and it goes: the thought of your eyes, heather brown, make my pale blue eyes glisten. And I wonder how God chose which strand to grant your first white hair. You make an art form of disappearance and teach me that life is second nature. So I reach out at your request, finding the strand between my thumb and finger. The stillness, while you wait for the pinch of the pluck. Eyes widen as I rip the strand from its root and realize you are determined to live, be free, and love what you love, like a baby in the shade, gurgling. Oh, most alive thing changing before my eyes, let me change with you. Let your scalp be the loom of my life, and let your white hairs weave a seam of double stitching to bind us. This silver strand I hold is momentous, for it is the last thread I shall ever pluck from your head. And letting go of this white hair in the warm and shining sun, I let it float upon the air and turn with time and times begun. For the stillness while you wait for the pinch of the pluck. Eyes widen as I rip the strand from its root and realize you are determined to live, be free, and love what you love unabashed like a baby in the shade, gurgling, oh, most alive thing. Changing before my eyes, let me change with you. Let your scalp be the loom of my life, and let your white hairs weave a seam of double stitching to bind us. And this silver strand I hold is momentous, for it is the last thread I will ever pluck from your head, and letting go of this white hair in the warm and shining sun, I let it float upon the air and turn with time and times begun.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you for everything. This was beautiful. And I'm sure we have a lot more to talk about. So who knows, people?
The same. I hope you're listening to meet maybe my mom and my brother sometime too. It'd be great.
That would be
so much
extraordinary. So check the show notes for all the amazing work Mícheál does. Oh my God. Yes. So good. And thank you again for a wonderful, beautiful conversation.